Have you ever wondered what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones who hurt you the most? I'm about to share a story that changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and survival. It's a story about the most toxic thing my family tried to normalize, and how it nearly cost me my life. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving when I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, trying to find a way to hold my body that didn't make the pain shoot through my ribs like lightning. My name is Sarah. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a suburb outside of Denver, Colorado. Well, I used to live there with my husband, Michael, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That morning, as I carefully applied concealer over the purple-yellow bruises spreading across my ribcage, I practiced the smile I would need to wear at my mother's Thanksgiving dinner the next day. The bruises were fresh, only 3 days old. Michael had come home from his job at the accounting firm, particularly stressed about a client meeting that hadn't gone well. I'd made the mistake of suggesting we could eat leftovers instead of the elaborate dinner he expected. That's all it took. One suggestion about dinner, and suddenly I was pressed against our bedroom wall, with his hands gripping my sides so hard I could feel each individual finger digging into my flesh. As I stood there in the bathroom, I could still hear his voice from that night, calm and controlled, even as he hurt me. "Rebecca, you know I've had a hard day. Why do you have to make things difficult?" That was Michael's gift, really. He could make violence sound reasonable, like I was the one causing problems by existing in a way that inconvenienced him. I lowered my shirt carefully, wincing as the fabric brushed against the tender skin. Tomorrow would be Thanksgiving at my childhood home in Littleton, about 40 minutes away. My mother, Patricia, had been preparing for weeks, calling me daily with updates about the menu and reminders about what time to arrive. She took pride in hosting perfect family gatherings where everyone played their assigned roles. My role was the devoted wife, and I'd learned long ago that disappointing my mother came with its own special kind of pain. The drive to my parents' house the next afternoon felt longer than usual. Every bump in the road sent sharp pains through my torso, and I had to grip the steering wheel to keep from crying out. Michael sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone and occasionally reaching over to pat my knee in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like a warning. "Remember to thank your mother for all her hard work today," he said without looking up. "And try not to be so sensitive about everything. Your family doesn't need to hear about every little complaint you have." I nodded because speaking felt dangerous. The truth was, I'd stopped complaining years ago. Complaints led to consequences, and I'd learned it was safer to smile and agree and pretend everything was perfect. That's what good wives did, according to my mother. Good wives endured. When we pulled into my parents' driveway, I could see my younger sister Emma's car already there. Emma was 28, unmarried, and constantly subjected to my mother's disappointment about that fact. She worked as a nurse at Denver Health, and I envied her independence, even as I watched my mother chip away at her confidence every time they spoke. My mother opened the door before we even reached it, her face lighting up at the sight of Michael. "There's my favorite son-in-law!" she exclaimed, pulling him into a hug while barely glancing at me. She was wearing her holiday apron, the one with autumn leaves embroidered around the edges, and her gray-streaked hair was perfectly styled as always. At 59, Patricia Morrison took pride in being the picture of domestic perfection. "Sarah, you look tired," she said when she finally acknowledged me. "I hope you're not coming down with something. You know how important today is?" Her eyes did that thing where they seemed to scan me for flaws, and I instinctively straightened my posture, even though the movement made my ribs scream. Inside, the house smelled like turkey and sage, and all the familiar scents of Thanksgiving. My father, Robert, was in his usual spot in the living room, watching football with the volume too loud. He glanced up when we entered, gave a brief nod, then returned his attention to the game. That was Dad's way, present but not really there, aware of everything but choosing to see nothing. Emma was in the kitchen, chopping celery for the stuffing. When she saw me, her face broke into a genuine smile that faltered as soon as she got a good look at me. "Sarah, oh my God, are you okay? You look..." "She's fine," my mother interrupted, stepping between us. Sarah, why don't you help set the table? The good china is already out. Michael, would you like a drink? Robert bought that whiskey you enjoyed last time. As Michael followed my mother to the liquor cabinet, Emma grabbed my arm. I couldn't help the small gasp that escaped when her fingers brushed against a bruise hidden under my sleeve. Her eyes widened, and I saw the moment she understood. Sarah, she whispered, but I shook my head quickly. Please, I mouthed silently. Not today. The next hour passed in a blur of preparations. I moved carefully around the kitchen, trying to help without revealing how much pain I was in. Every reach for a plate, every bend to get something from a low cabinet, sent fresh waves of agony through my midsection. I'd gotten good at hiding pain over the years, but this was different. The bruising was deeper, more extensive, and something felt wrong inside my chest when I breathed too deeply. More family began arriving around 3 o'clock. My Aunt Linda and Uncle Frank came with my cousins Jessica and Ryan. My grandmother Helen, my mother's mother, arrived with her new boyfriend, a man named Earl who seemed nice enough, but clearly didn't know what he'd walked into. There were others too, second cousins, great aunts, the extended Morrison family gathering for our annual celebration of gratitude and denial. I was carrying the green bean casserole to the dining room when it happened. The dish wasn't particularly heavy, but as I lifted it, something shifted in my chest. The pain was so sudden and intense that I stumbled, barely managing to set the dish on the sideboard before doubling over. I pressed my hand to my ribs, trying to breathe through the agony when I felt Emma's hand on my back. Sarah, what's wrong? Talk to me, she said urgently. Before I could answer, my mother appeared. What's all this drama about? She looked at me bent over, clutching my side, and her face hardened. Sarah, we have guests. Whatever this is, deal with it quietly. Mom, she's hurt, Emma protested. Look at her, she can barely stand. My mother stepped closer, and I thought for a moment she might actually help. Instead, she placed her hand on my side, right where the bruising was worst, and pressed. The pain was so intense that tears immediately sprang to my eyes. See? My mother said to Emma, keeping her hand pressed against my ribs. Sarah just needs to remember what's important. Don't you, sweetheart? I nodded frantically, hoping she'd let go. When she finally did, I had to grab the wall to stay upright. The room was starting to spin, and each breath felt like I was trying to inhale through a straw filled with broken glass. Mom, she needs a doctor, Emma insisted, already reaching for her phone. My mother's hand shot out and knocked the phone from Emma's grasp. It clattered across the hardwood floor, and several family members turned to look at the commotion. Absolutely not, my mother hissed. We are not ruining Thanksgiving with Sarah's attention-seeking behavior. She's fine, aren't you, Sarah? I tried to speak, but all that came out was a wet, rattling sound. That's when I tasted it, metallic and warm in the back of my throat. Blood. Ha, everyone, dinner is served, my mother announced brightly, as if I wasn't standing there struggling to breathe. Please take your seats. Sarah was just having a little moment, but she's fine now. Michael appeared at my side, his hand gripping my upper arm. To anyone watching, it probably looked supportive, but I could feel his fingers digging into the muscle. Come on, honey, let's not make a scene, he murmured in my ear. Somehow, I made it to my seat at the dinner table. The room kept tilting, and I had to focus on staying upright. Around me, family members chatted and passed dishes, the sounds blending into a distant hum. I could see Emma watching me with growing alarm, could see my cousin Maria, who was in her second year of nursing school, frowning as she observed my labored breathing. Sarah's not eating, Aunt Linda observed. Patricia, didn't you teach your girls to appreciate a good meal? My mother's laugh was sharp. Oh, Sarah's always watching her figure. Michael likes his women slim, don't you, Michael? I tried to lift my fork, but my hand was shaking too badly. The pain in my chest was getting worse, spreading like fire with each shallow breath. Then the coughing started, deep, wet coughs that I couldn't suppress. I covered my mouth with my napkin, trying to muffle the sound, but when I pulled it away, the white fabric was spotted with red. Oh my God! Maria said, standing up. She's coughing up blood. We need to call 911 right now. "You will do no such thing," my mother said, her voice like ice. "Sarah has a little cold, that's all. She's being dramatic." "Patricia, this is serious," Maria insisted. "I'm in nursing school. Coughing up blood could mean internal bleeding. If her ribs are broken, they could have punctured." "Are you a doctor?" my mother interrupted. "No, but—" "Then sit down and mind your own business." Emma stood up then, her face flushed with anger. "This is insane! She needs help!" She pulled out her phone again, but my mother was faster, grabbing it and holding it out of reach. "I said no," my mother stated firmly. "What kind of family airs their dirty laundry to strangers? What would people think?" "Who cares what people think?" Emma shouted. "Sarah is dying!" The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Dying. Was I dying? It felt like it. Each breath was harder than the last, and I could feel wetness in my lungs, hear the gurgling sound when I tried to inhale. The room was getting darker around the edges, and I couldn't focus on faces anymore. Everyone needs to calm down," my mother said, walking behind my chair. She placed her hands on my shoulders, and I felt her thumb find another bruise, pressing down hard. "Sarah, tell them you're fine. Tell them you're just being silly." I tried to speak, but instead, I coughed again. This time, blood didn't just spot the napkin. It poured out, running down my chin and onto my plate. Someone screamed. Multiple chairs scraped back as people jumped to their feet. "Call 911, Maria yelled. "Nobody move," my mother commanded. "This is a family matter. Sarah knows better than to involve outsiders in family business. Don't you, Sarah? Good wives handle things privately. Good wives endure." Those words. Good wives endure. I'd heard them my whole life, whispered in my ear when I skinned my knee as a child, and she told me to stop crying. Repeated when I came home from school with bruises from a boy who liked to pinch me, and she said I must have encouraged him somehow. Drilled into me when I first told her Michael had pushed me during an argument, and she said that's what men did when women forgot their place. I slumped forward, my face hitting my plate. The world was fading, sounds becoming distant and muffled. I could hear arguing, shouting, Emma's voice high and panicked. But I couldn't breathe anymore. My lungs felt full of liquid, and each attempt to inhale produced nothing but a horrible bubbling sound. Then I heard it. The crash of breaking glass, so loud it cut through everything else. Emma had picked up a dining room chair and thrown it through the front window. Glass scattered across the porch and lawn, and cold November air rushed in. "What have you done?" my mother shrieked. "You've ruined everything! The neighbors will see!" That was the point, I realized through my fading consciousness. Emma knew the neighbors would call the police if they heard glass breaking and screaming. She was saving my life the only way she could. I don't remember the paramedics arriving. I don't remember the frantic work to stabilize me or the rush to the hospital. What I found out later was that I flatlined in the ambulance. My heart stopped for 4 minutes. 4 minutes where I was clinically dead, while my mother stood in our family home, telling anyone who would listen that I was just being dramatic. When I woke up 3 days later in the ICU, the first thing I saw was Emma's face, puffy and red from crying. She was holding my hand so tightly it almost hurt, but I didn't want her to let go. A tube ran down my throat, helping me breathe, and my chest was wrapped in bandages. Machines beeped steadily around me, monitoring my vital signs. The doctor came in soon after, a kind man with silver hair, who explained what had happened in gentle terms. 3 ribs had been broken, one so badly that it punctured my lung, causing it to collapse. The blood in my lungs had nearly drowned me. If Emma hadn't broken that window, if the paramedics had arrived even 5 minutes later, I wouldn't have survived. He showed me x-rays on his tablet, pointing out the fresh breaks, but also older ones. Some healed wrong, some still healing. The evidence of years of abuse was written in my bones, a history of violence I'd tried so hard to hide. When he asked how long this had been happening, I couldn't answer. Not because of the tube in my throat, but because I honestly didn't know anymore. When had Michael's anger turned into violence? When had my mother's strict expectations become complicity in my abuse? It all blurred together into one long nightmare I'd been living without realizing I was allowed to wake up. Emma stayed with me every day, taking time off from her job to be there. She told me about the aftermath of that Thanksgiving dinner, how my mother had tried to stop the paramedics from taking me, insisting I just needed to rest. How she'd stood in the doorway, blocking their path until my father, of all people, had physically moved her aside. How she'd followed the ambulance to the hospital, not out of concern, but to control the narrative, telling anyone who would listen that I'd always been weak, always been dramatic, always been difficult. She kept saying good wives endure, Emma told me, tears streaming down her face. Even when they were doing CPR, even when you were literally dead, she kept saying it. The police came to take my statement once I was stable enough to talk. 2 officers, one older with a gentle manner, one younger who took careful notes. I told them about Michael, about the beatings that had escalated over our 5 years of marriage. I told them about that night 3 days before Thanksgiving, when he'd gripped my side so hard he broke my ribs. But when they asked about my mother's role, about how she'd prevented people from calling for help, I hesitated. She saw you were injured and stopped people from calling 911? The older officer asked. I nodded. She physically prevented your sister from calling for help? Another nod. Ma'am, that's not just enabling abuse. That could be criminal negligence, possibly even attempted murder by omission. The words sat heavy in the room. My mother, the woman who'd raised me, who'd made my Halloween costumes and driven me to dance classes, had nearly let me die rather than admit our family was anything less than perfect. Maria, my cousin, came to visit on the 4th day. She looked exhausted but determined. I wrote down everything, she said, pulling out a notebook. Times, exact quotes, who said what. I'm pre-med now, switching from nursing, and I know how important accurate documentation is. Sarah, what your mom did, it wasn't just wrong, it was criminal. She watched you dying and chose to protect her image instead of protecting you. The notebook was filled with her neat handwriting, documenting the entire Thanksgiving dinner in clinical detail. 3:47 p.m. Sarah exhibiting signs of respiratory distress. 4:15 p.m. Patricia pressed on Sarah's injured ribs, causing visible pain response. 4:22 p.m. Sarah began coughing blood, indicating possible internal bleeding. 4:24 p.m. Patricia prevented multiple attempts to call emergency services. I'll testify, Maria said firmly. I don't care what the family says. What I saw was attempted murder. Michael didn't come to the hospital. I found out later he'd been arrested that same night after Emma told the police about my injuries. He'd hired a lawyer and was already spinning the story. I was clumsy, I'd fallen down the stairs. I was mentally unstable and making false accusations. The same old song abusers always sing. My hospital room became a strange kind of sanctuary. For the first time in years, I was safe. No one could hurt me there. The nurses were kind, checking on me frequently, and there was a social worker named Janet who specialized in domestic violence cases. She sat with me for hours, explaining my options, helping me understand that what happened to me wasn't normal, wasn't acceptable, wasn't my fault. Leaving is the most dangerous time, Janet explained. Abusers often escalate when they feel they're losing control. We need to make a safety plan. A safety plan. The phrase felt foreign. I'd spent so long in survival mode, just trying to get through each day without triggering Michael's anger, that the idea of actually planning for safety seemed revolutionary. On day 6, I was moved from the ICU to a regular room. The tube was out of my throat, though breathing still hurt. Every inhale reminded me of that dining room table, of drowning in my own blood while my mother insisted I was fine. That's when she tried to visit. I heard her before I saw her, that familiar voice in the hallway arguing with hospital security. I'm her mother. I have every right to see her. This is ridiculous. I demand to speak to whoever's in charge. Emma appeared in my doorway, looking grim. She's here. Security won't let her up without your permission. What do you want to do? I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me, the little girl who still wanted her mother's approval, wanted to say yes. But the woman who'd almost died while her mother watched? She had a different answer. No, I said quietly. I don't want to see her. Emma nodded and left to deliver the message. I could hear my mother's voice rising, shrill and indignant, before security eventually escorted her out. It was the first time in my life I'd ever told her no. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. The next few days blurred together. There were police interviews, meetings with prosecutors, conversations with Janet about shelters and restraining orders. I learned terms I'd never thought would apply to my life: protective order, emergency custody, victim's advocate. Each one felt like another step away from the life I'd known, and towards something I couldn't quite imagine yet. Emma brought me clothes and toiletries from home, packing what she could while Michael was at work. She said the house felt different, smaller somehow, like all the life had been sucked out of it. She found journals I'd hidden in the back of my closet, documentation of abuse I'd kept without really knowing why, photos of bruises I'd taken just in case, though I'd never known what that case might be. "You were preparing to leave," Emma said, looking through the evidence. "Part of you knew this wasn't right." Maybe she was right. Maybe somewhere deep down, beneath all my mother's programming about being a good wife, I'd known I deserved better. But knowing and acting are two different things, and it had taken nearly dying to bridge that gap. On day 10, 2 detectives came with more questions. They'd been building a case against Michael, and the evidence was overwhelming. The hospital photos showed bruising consistent with being grabbed and shaken. The X-rays revealed a pattern of abuse going back years. Neighbors had come forward with reports of hearing screaming and crashes from our house. One elderly woman said she'd almost called the police several times, but didn't want to interfere in a private matter. "We're also looking into charges against your mother," the lead detective said. "What she did, preventing emergency aid when someone is dying, that's criminal. Multiple witnesses saw her actively stop people from calling 911. That's not just bad judgment. That's criminal negligence at minimum." The thought of my mother facing criminal charges felt surreal. This was the woman who'd been PTA president, who'd organized church bake sales, who'd been the picture of maternal devotion in public. But I remembered her thumb pressing into my bruised shoulder, her calm insistence that I was being dramatic while I coughed up blood, and I knew the detectives were right. She wasn't just complicit. She was an active participant in my abuse. Janet helped me apply for an emergency protective order against Michael. The process was terrifying. Forms to fill out, statements to make, a court appearance to schedule. But Janet stayed with me through it all, explaining each step, making sure I understood my rights. The temporary order was granted immediately based on the medical evidence. The permanent order would require a hearing where I'd have to face Michael in court. "I can't," I told Janet. "I can't be in the same room with him." "You won't be alone," she assured me. "Emma will be there. I'll be there. You'll have a victim's advocate with you the entire time. And remember, he can't hurt you anymore. Not with deputies in the room." The thought of sheriff's deputies standing between me and Michael was comforting, but it also drove home how far things had deteriorated. How had I gone from a woman planning Thanksgiving dinner to a woman who needed armed protection from her husband? I was discharged after 2 weeks in the hospital with a list of follow-up appointments that seemed endless. Lung specialist, trauma therapist, physical therapy for my ribs, regular checkups to ensure my lung was healing properly. Emma had prepared her spare bedroom for me, refusing to let me even consider going back to the house I'd shared with Michael. "You're staying with me," she said firmly. "No arguments. I've already got your medications organized, and I've meal prepped for the week. All you have to do is heal." Her apartment was small but bright, on the 3rd floor of a building in Capitol Hill. It felt like a different world from the suburban house I'd shared with Michael. No one here knew me as Michael's wife or Patricia Morrison's daughter. I was just another person recovering from something, deserving of privacy and peace. Those first nights were the hardest. Without the constant noise of the hospital, the silence felt oppressive. I'd wake up gasping, feeling like I was drowning again, tasting blood that wasn't there. Emma would rush in, turn on the lights, remind me where I was. Safe. Away from Michael, away from my mother. Safe. PTSD, my new therapist, Dr. Williams, explained during our first session. Your body remembers the trauma even when your mind knows you're safe. We'll work on coping strategies, ways to ground yourself when the flashbacks come. Dr. Williams was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes and an office full of plants. She specialized in trauma from domestic violence and family abuse. Over our sessions, she helped me understand how my mother's conditioning from childhood had made me vulnerable to Michael's abuse. "Good wives endure," she repeated, when I told her about my mother's favorite phrase. Think about what that really means. Endure what? Pain? Abuse? The complete erasure of self? Your mother taught you that suffering was not just normal, but virtuous. That's a form of abuse in itself. It was hard to wrap my mind around the idea that my mother had been abusing me long before Michael came along. But as we talked through my childhood, patterns emerged. The time I'd come home with a black eye from a boy at school, and she'd asked what I'd done to provoke him. The way she'd dismissed my complaints about an uncle who made me uncomfortable, saying I was being dramatic. How she'd told me, when I was just 12, that men had tempers, and good women learned to navigate them. "She was grooming you," Dr. Williams said gently. "Not in a sexual way, but grooming you to accept abuse as normal. She prepared you to be a victim." The words hit me like a physical blow. My mother had prepared me to be a victim. Every lesson about being a good wife, every dismissal of my feelings, every time she'd told me to endure, it had all been preparation for this moment, dying at her Thanksgiving table while she protected my abuser instead of me. Emma drove me to the courthouse for the protective order hearing. My hands shook as we walked through security, and I kept checking over my shoulder for Michael. The victim's advocate, a woman named Carla, met us outside the courtroom. She explained what would happen. The judge would review the evidence. Michael's lawyer would try to discredit me, and I'd have to testify about the abuse. "Remember," Carla said, "you're not on trial. He is. Stick to the facts. Don't let his lawyer rattle you, and if you need a break, just say so." When we entered the courtroom, Michael was already there with his lawyer, both in expensive suits. Michael looked different, smaller somehow, less intimidating in this official setting, but when his eyes met mine, I saw the familiar anger there, barely controlled. Emma grabbed my hand and squeezed. The hearing was brutal. Michael's lawyer painted me as unstable, vindictive, a woman scorned making false accusations. He suggested my injuries were self-inflicted or accidental. He pointed out that I'd never called the police before, never sought help, as if that somehow meant the abuse hadn't happened. But my lawyer was prepared. She presented the medical records, the x-rays showing years of abuse, the photos Emma had taken of my bruises. She called witnesses, the elderly neighbor who'd heard screaming, the emergency room doctor who'd treated me, Maria, who described the Thanksgiving dinner in clinical detail. When it was my turn to testify, I thought I'd fall apart, but something strange happened. As I sat in that witness chair, telling my story to the judge, I felt powerful for the first time in years. Each word was a reclamation, a taking back of the narrative Michael and my mother had written for me. "He broke my ribs 3 days before Thanksgiving," I stated clearly. "When I tried to leave, he said no one would believe me. My mother proved him right. She watched me dying and chose to protect him instead of me." Michael's lawyer tried to shake my testimony, but I had the truth and the evidence on my side. The judge granted the protective order for 2 years, the maximum allowed. As we left the courthouse, Michael's lawyer was already talking about appeals. But I didn't care. I had a legal document saying he couldn't come near me. It felt like armor. The criminal case against Michael moved forward slowly. There were depositions, meetings with prosecutors, endless paperwork. I learned that domestic violence cases often took over a year to resolve. The prosecutor was confident. The medical evidence was damning, and they had multiple witnesses from Thanksgiving. But she warned me that Michael would likely plead down to a lesser charge to avoid jail time. It's not fair," she admitted, "but it's often how these cases go. The important thing is that it's on his record. If he hurts someone else, there's a pattern established." The case against my mother was more complicated. The prosecutor explained that while what she did was morally reprehensible, proving criminal negligence was harder. They were exploring charges, but she warned me not to get my hopes up. She actively prevented people from calling 911, I argued. I was dying and she stopped them from helping me. I know, the prosecutor said, and we're going to try. But these cases, where someone fails to act rather than actively causing harm, they're harder to prosecute. The law doesn't always align with justice. Meanwhile, I was trying to rebuild my life. I'd taken extended leave from my job as a marketing coordinator, but I couldn't afford to stay out of work forever. My boss, thankfully, was understanding. She'd suspected something was wrong for a while, she told me, but hadn't known how to help. She arranged for me to work from home initially, easing back into responsibilities as I healed. Money was tight. Michael had emptied our joint accounts and canceled my credit cards as soon as he was served with divorce papers. I'd gone from comfortable middle class to scraping by overnight. Emma helped where she could, but she was a young nurse with her own bills. Janet connected me with resources: emergency funds for domestic violence survivors, food banks, utility assistance programs I'd never imagined I'd need. The shame of needing help was almost as hard as the abuse itself. I'd been raised to be self-sufficient, to handle problems privately. Standing in line at the food bank, I felt exposed and vulnerable. But the volunteers were kind, many of them survivors themselves, and slowly I learned that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was survival. My divorce lawyer, a fierce woman named Diane, warned me the divorce would be contentious. Colorado was a no-fault state, which meant Michael's abuse wasn't technically relevant to the division of assets. But Diane was strategic. She documented how Michael had controlled the finances, hidden assets, used money as a weapon. She fought for every penny I was entitled to. He wants to leave you with nothing, she told me after one particularly nasty meeting with his lawyer. But we're not going to let that happen. 3 months after Thanksgiving, I moved into my own apartment. It was tiny, a studio in an older building in Aurora, but it was mine. Emma helped me move in with the few belongings I'd managed to retrieve from the house. We hung curtains, arranged my medications on a shelf, set up a small table where I could eat meals alone for the first time in years. That first night alone was terrifying. Every sound made me jump. A neighbor's footsteps in the hallway sent me checking the locks. A car backfiring had me hiding in the bathroom. But as the sun rose and I was still safe, still breathing, I felt a tiny spark of hope. I'd survived the night. I could survive another. Dr. Williams and I worked on trauma processing in our weekly sessions. She taught me grounding techniques for when the flashbacks came. 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, 1 I could taste. We practiced breathing exercises to combat the feeling of drowning that still sometimes overwhelmed me. Trauma rewires the brain, she explained. Your body learned that the world was dangerous, that people who should protect you wouldn't. We're working to create new neural pathways, new associations. It takes time, but healing is possible. Some days I believed her. Others, I felt broken beyond repair. The nightmares were relentless. I'd wake up gasping, feeling phantom hands on my ribs, tasting blood that wasn't there. Sleep became something I both craved and feared. One particularly bad night, I called the suicide hotline. Not because I wanted to die, I'd fought too hard to live, but because the weight of everything felt unbearable. The counselor on the other end was patient, letting me cry, reminding me that trauma responses were normal, that feeling overwhelmed didn't mean I was weak. You survived something horrible, she said. It's okay to not be okay right now. 6 months after Thanksgiving, Michael accepted a plea deal. Assault in the 2nd degree, 3 years probation, mandatory anger management classes, no jail time. The prosecutor apologized, said it was the best they could do with the resources they had. I sat in the courtroom as the deal was read, watching Michael smirk at his lawyer's cleverness. The injustice of it burned, but at least there was a record now, a conviction, proof that what happened to me was real. The case against my mother went nowhere. The prosecutor decided not to pursue charges, citing insufficient evidence of criminal intent. She'd had a good lawyer who argued that she'd been in shock, that she'd truly believed I was being dramatic, that hindering emergency response wasn't the same as causing harm. The fact that multiple witnesses saw her actively prevent help didn't matter. She walked free, reputation intact in her social circles. Emma was furious. "She almost killed you," she raged after hearing the news. "How is that not criminal?" But I was too tired to be angry anymore. My mother had chosen her image over my life, and now she had to live with that. The family was split. Some sided with her, believing her version where I'd exaggerated everything for attention. Others, like Maria, and surprisingly Aunt Linda, cut contact with her entirely. The Morrison family gatherings I'd grown up attending became a thing of the past. My mother tried to contact me several times. Letters arrived at Emma's apartment, forwarded mail I recognized by her handwriting. I threw them away unopened at first, but curiosity eventually won. They were exactly what I'd expected. No apologies, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just Bible verses about forgiveness and familiar refrains about family loyalty. One particularly toxic letter accused me of destroying the family, of being a disappointment, of failing as a wife and daughter. I kept that one as a reminder of why I'd left. A year after that Thanksgiving, I was still healing. My ribs had mended, though they ached when the weather changed. My lung function was mostly normal, though I'd never be a runner. The physical scars were fading. The emotional ones were a work in progress. I'd started attending a support group for domestic violence survivors. Every Thursday night, 8 to 10 women gathered in a church basement to share their stories. There was Sandra, whose husband had broken her jaw. Keisha, whose boyfriend had stalked her for months after she left. Deb, whose own sister had helped her abusive husband find her at a shelter. Each story was different, but the patterns were heartbreakingly familiar. "The first time he hit me, I was so shocked I laughed," one woman shared. "I actually laughed because it seemed so absurd. This man who said he loved me had just backhanded me over burned toast. My mother was visiting, and you know what she said? 'Well, dear, men don't like burned toast.'" The group became my lifeline. These women understood in ways well-meaning friends couldn't. They knew the shame of staying too long, the complex grief of losing not just a relationship, but an entire life, the way trauma could make you jump at shadows months after the danger had passed. I finally felt strong enough to retrieve more of my belongings from the house I'd shared with Michael. Emma and 2 male friends came with me, along with a sheriff's deputy, since I had a court order allowing me to collect my things. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. The same neat lawn, the same flower boxes I'd planted. But stepping inside felt like entering a tomb. Michael had destroyed things, I discovered. Photos of us were smashed. My grandmother's china was broken. Clothes were cut up and thrown around the bedroom. The violence he could no longer inflict on my body, he'd taken out on objects. But I found what I'd come for. Important documents. A few pieces of jewelry that had been my grandmother's. Photos from before Michael that showed a younger, happier version of myself. As we loaded boxes into Emma's car, our former neighbor, Mrs. Chen, came out. She was elderly, walked with a cane, had always smiled and waved when I'd walked to the mailbox with bruises I thought I'd hidden. "I should have called the police," she said quietly. "I heard things, saw things. I should have helped." "It's okay," I told her, meaning it. I wasn't ready for help then. That was the truth I'd learned in therapy. People had seen signs. Some, like Emma and Maria, had tried to help in small ways. But until I was ready to leave, until I believed I deserved better, no amount of outside intervention would have saved me. The tragic irony was that it took nearly dying for me to finally believe my life was worth saving. 18 months after that Thanksgiving, I was living a life I couldn't have imagined. My apartment was small, but decorated with plants and artwork I'd chosen myself. I'd received a promotion at work, partly because I could now focus on my career without navigating Michael's moods. I'd even started dating. Nothing serious, just coffee with a kind man named James from my hiking group who understood that I needed to go slow. Yes, I'd joined a hiking group. My lungs, the ones that had filled with blood, now carried me up mountain trails. Never the steep ones, and I always needed more breaks than others. But I could do it. Each summit felt like a small victory over everyone who'd tried to keep me down. Emma and I grew closer than we'd ever been. She'd saved my life by breaking that window, choosing me over family harmony. We had dinner every Sunday, a new tradition to replace the toxic family gatherings of our past. Sometimes Maria joined us, or other cousins who'd sided with truth over comfort. My father reached out once, a brief email saying he was sorry for not protecting me. I thought about responding for weeks before sending back a single line. You knew and did nothing. He didn't write again, and I was okay with that. Some bridges were meant to stay burned. The hardest part of healing was accepting that my mother would never acknowledge what she'd done. In her mind, she'd been protecting the family, upholding values, being a good mother. The fact that her version of good mothering had nearly killed me was something she'd never face. Dr. Williams helped me understand that waiting for an apology that would never come was another form of self-harm. You can't change her, she said. You can only change how you respond to her. Living well, healing, thriving, that's your response. So I worked on thriving. I volunteered at the domestic violence shelter that had helped me, sharing my story with women who were where I'd been. I spoke at training sessions for emergency responders, helping them understand why victims might not seem grateful for help, why family members might actively interfere with rescue efforts. My mother stood over me as I was dying and told people I was being dramatic. I'd tell rooms full of paramedics and police officers. She wasn't evil. She was a product of generations of women taught that keeping men happy mattered more than keeping women alive. Understanding that doesn't excuse it, but it helps explain why domestic violence is so hard to escape. The whole system is designed to keep us trapped. 2 years after that Thanksgiving, I got a call that my mother had been hospitalized with chest pains. Emma, who heard through the family grapevine, asked if I wanted to know. I thought about it for a long time before deciding I did. Not because I forgave her, but because I needed to see if I could face her without falling apart. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, older, frailer. When she saw me, her face cycled through emotions: surprise, hope, anger, settling on disapproval. I suppose you're happy, she said, seeing me like this. No, I replied honestly. I'm not happy. I'm just here. I did everything for this family, she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. Everything, and you destroyed it all with your lies. I could have argued, could have reminded her that she'd watched me die, that multiple witnesses had seen her prevent help. But I realized, standing there, that I didn't need her to admit the truth. I knew what happened. The people who mattered knew what happened. Her denial was her prison, not mine. I hope you get better, I said, meaning it. Then I left and didn't look back. That night, I cooked dinner in my little kitchen. Nothing fancy, just pasta with vegetables. But I made it exactly how I liked it, without worrying about anyone else's preferences. I ate at my small table, reading a book Emma had recommended, occasionally glancing at the window that looked out over the city lights. My ribs didn't hurt anymore, hadn't for months. My breathing was clear and easy. The nightmares still came sometimes, but less frequently, and I had tools to handle them when they did. I was building a life free from violence, free from the toxic belief that good wives endure anything, free from people who would hurt me and call it love. My phone buzzed with a text from James, asking if I wanted to try a new hiking trail that weekend. I thought about it, considering my schedule, my energy levels, my own desires, things I'd never been allowed to consider before. Yes, I texted back. That sounds perfect. Later that evening, Emma called to check on me after the hospital visit. How are you feeling? She asked. Free, I answered after thinking about it. I feel free. And I was. Free from Michael's fists and controlling rage. Free from my mother's toxic programming. Free from the belief that suffering was noble, that endurance was the highest virtue a woman could possess. Free to build a life where love didn't hurt, where family protected instead of harmed, where asking for help was strength, not weakness. The most toxic thing my family tried to normalize was the idea that abuse was love, that pain was just the price women paid for relationships. They dressed it up in pretty words about devotion and tradition, but underneath it was all the same message. Your suffering matters less than their comfort. It nearly killed me, literally stopped my heart for 4 minutes on a gurney while my mother stood in her perfect house, insisting I was being dramatic. But I survived. Not just the physical trauma, but the deeper wound of realizing the people who should have protected me had been complicit in my harm all along. Recovery isn't linear. There are still days when I catch myself apologizing for existing, when I flinch at sudden movements, when I have to remind myself that disagreeing with someone isn't dangerous anymore. But there are more days when I wake up grateful for this small, quiet life I've built from the ashes of the old one. I think about the woman I was before that Thanksgiving, the one who stood in her bathroom, carefully covering bruises, practicing smiles, believing that enduring abuse made her a good wife. I wish I could tell her what I know now, that good wives don't endure abuse. They leave. That real love doesn't require suffering. That choosing yourself over family harmony isn't selfish. Sometimes it's the only way to survive. But she had to learn those lessons the hard way, through broken ribs and a punctured lung, through a heart that stopped and somehow started again, through a sister brave enough to shatter glass and shatter silence, through cousins who chose truth over comfort, through strangers who offered help when family failed. The scar on my ribs from the chest tube has faded to a thin white line. I see it sometimes when I'm getting dressed, run my fingers over it like a reminder. Here's where I almost died. Here's where I chose to live instead. Here's proof that I survived the most toxic thing my family tried to normalize and built something better from the wreckage. That's my story. The story of how I learned that good wives endure was a lie designed to keep women suffering in silence. The story of how it took dying to finally start living. The story of how the most toxic things families normalize can only thrive in darkness, and sometimes breaking a window to let the light in is the greatest act of love possible. If you're reading this and any of it sounds familiar, the bruises you hide, the excuses you make, the family members who tell you to endure what no one should have to endure, please know that you deserve better. That love shouldn't hurt. That choosing your safety over family comfort isn't betrayal, it's survival. That sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones you need protection from. It took me 32 years to learn those truths. It cost me broken bones and a stopped heart. But I'm here now, breathing easy, building a life where no one's comfort matters more than my safety, where no tradition is worth dying for, where the only thing I endure is my own healing journey, one day at a time. That Thanksgiving, I nearly became another statistic. A woman killed by domestic violence while her family watched. Instead, I became a survivor. Not because I was special or strong, but because my sister loved me more than she feared our mother's disapproval. Because a cousin chose truth over family politics. Because strangers did their jobs even when my own mother tried to stop them. The most toxic thing my family tried to normalize almost killed me. But it didn't. And now I get to live, really live, in a world where good women don't endure abuse. They leave it behind and build something better. One breath, one day, one small moment of freedom at a time.